Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Christian History. We are having our episode of the week of December 29th, which is our last episode of the year. And we are glad to have a great episode that we're going to learn more about Thomas Becket, or Thomas Becket, as he is sometimes stylized and known, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury and who actually was murdered on December 29th, 1170, on this very day that the podcast is launching. And we're very glad to have Professor Michael Staunton with us, who is with University College Dublin in Ireland, and he is a professor of history there that focuses on medieval history. So, Professor, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Nick. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So tell us, for those who maybe never watched a movie that some of us would have watched growing up, right, with Peter O'Toole and Richard Burton, I think were the two stars of that movie. The story of Thomas Becket. As the Archbishop of Canterbury, and certainly the Canterbury Tales are something that are very familiar to so many of us. But before we get to that, tell us a little bit more about Becket and who he was, and maybe also about his relationship with the future king, Henry II.
Oh, now that you mentioned the movie Becket, that starts when Thomas is already in his grave. And most people, when they start talking about Thomas Becket, they begin with his murder because that's what he's most famous for, his murder
Sure.
at Canterbury Cathedral in December 29th, as you said, 1170. And it's from that time that people start to tell his story, and they tell it in various different ways. There's more written about Thomas Becket than about any English person of the Middle Ages. So we
Wow.
have all of this material telling his story. Everybody will tell it a little bit differently. So this is my quick version of it. Thomas was born in London, either in 1118 or 1120. He came from a reasonably well-off background. His father was a successful merchant, and his mother, named Matilda, they were both from Normandy. Significantly, he didn't come from a noble background, though, and this is something that it comes to be of consequence later on during his life when he starts to mix with this more elevated company. He's born in London. This is the aftermath of the Norman conquest of England. London is a very thriving city. He is educated. He's clearly very smart. There's no very early signs of a religious vocation by most accounts. So the ways that you can be successful in this world, if you're not from a noble background, it's usually by being educated. So he goes to Paris. He goes to Paris, which is at this point the most exciting intellectual world of Europe at the time. And but he doesn't shine as a student. In fact, he drops out after a year and he comes back to England, gets a job as an accountant,
Hmm.
then eventually starts to work his way up through the ranks of various kinds of jobs. He becomes a clerk working for the Archbishop of Canterbury. This is his big break. He becomes the part of the administration of the Archbishop. And then eventually he becomes the royal chancellor. So this is a very major position within the kingdom. And he's doing this against a background of some quite turbulent political times.
Mhm.
He's grown up during a time that is known to historians as the anarchy. And this is a period of 19 years when you have a sort of low-level civil war between two claimants to the throne. One of these claimants is a young man called Henry Plantagenet, or Henry of Anjou. And from this, you get the dynasty alternatively called the Plantagenets or the Angevins. And his name is Henry, and this is the man who will become of such importance to Thomas. Henry is a little bit younger than Thomas. Uh, he's a very um, uh, impressive figure. very impetuous, but also very capable. He invades England at the age of 14. And during Thomas's time working as a clerk for the Archbishop of Canterbury, he gets involved in brokering a peace between the two sides, and he facilitates the succession of Henry to the throne of England as King Henry II. And the year is 1154. Henry II asks around about who he should staff his administration with, and the Archbishop suggests this bright young man, Thomas Becket. He's a little bit older than Henry. Henry's only 20 at this time, but he's not that much older. So this
Can I
starts
ask you a question real quick
yeah,
on that
yeah,
while we're doing that? So was there a thing called as we know it now, or we understand, was there kind of a privy council that would have been around the king at that time? And so he's trying to put together, for those of us on this side of the pond that don't understand all that maybe necessarily, he's putting together his cabinet, right? He's putting together his core group of
exactly.
people that are really going to help him run the government, and he's trying to find the brightest and the best and the loyalist, right, that will actually
Mhm.
be a part of what he's trying to. Is that a fair
That's
way to say
exactly
that?
it.
Okay.
So the main people are, you have the chancellor, you have certain other senior figures, and the chancellor is the person who runs the writing office. And at this time, writing is becoming particularly important. So this is an important office in itself. Um, but it also is particularly important because of the bond between Henry and Thomas. So they are seen as being two allies in reform of the kingdom. So when Henry comes to the throne, he wants to shake things up. He wants to say, I'm going to bring back law and order after the anarchy. I'm going to make sure my enemies are submissive to me, all of these kinds of things. And Thomas is very much involved in this. So they take measures to reform, say, coinage, to reform public safety. There's the development of the common law really comes from this time. This is the most
Oh,
important phase.
okay.
And this is the background to what will be the dispute. But as yet, Thomas and Henry are very close. And they're not just close as political allies, they're friends as well. So the picture that we have, and this is written by Thomas's own biographers, people who witnessed it, they talk about Henry and Thomas as the greatest friends that there ever were in Christian times. They
Wow.
talk about them going out hunting together, feasting together, generally carousing together. And there's all of these descriptions of, Henry comes into Thomas's court, jumps off his horse, jumps over the table, they're wrestling together, all of these kinds of things. And you can see that maybe part of this from Thomas's point of view is because he comes from this non-noble background. He really takes to
Mm,
this with a great enthusiasm. So it's this personal bond and it's a kind of a political bond. As yet, there's no great sign that Thomas is any different to any of the other people in, let's call it a cabinet. It's a good
mhm.
description. Or his court. He is living the same kind of life. Um, and he is loyal to Henry. And when Henry needs a new Archbishop of Canterbury, it's obvious where he's going to look. So this happens in the year 1162. Uh, Thomas's old boss, Archbishop Theobald, dies. And there's a bit of time between his death and the appointment of Thomas. It's quite possible that, Henry might have had some doubts about it. But if anybody had any doubts about Thomas being an archbishop or any criticisms of him as a potential archbishop, it was that he didn't seem religious enough.
Mm,
And even Thomas himself seems to have had this view of himself. Again, this is from one of his biographies. When the news comes to him that Henry wants to make him archbishop, he's playing chess and he's wearing these elaborate clothes with, bright colors, ornaments hanging from them in a very noble style. And he says, me, looking like this? Is this the kind of guy that you want as an Archbishop of Canterbury, as leader of the church in England? And so,
And maybe not only that, do I want to give this up? Because I
do
want
I want to
to go
give
to,
this up?
I
That's
kind of
right.
like all these bubbles on me, and I like to
Yeah,
be able to drink my wine. And I like to be able to do
that's
what I
it.
want to do, and I don't know if I want to give that up or not.
That's it. And of course, there had been bishops and archbishops in the past who didn't give it up all that much. They managed to retain their archbishop, but they lived a fairly secular life. They grew fat on the riches of Canterbury and so on. He
Mhm.
had those predecessors. When he was appointed, uh, he wasn't yet a priest. He was a clerk. So to be to work in the archbishop's household, he was part of clerical orders. So
Mhm.
he was set apart from the rest of society. He wasn't supposed to go to taverns, for example. He wasn't supposed to play boisterous games, though he may have done a bit of that. He could have got married even, but he wasn't a priest yet. So he was made priest the day before he became archbishop. Then he's consecrated archbishop. And even at the time of his election, there's some murmurings against this person is too close to the king. And this person is not sufficiently religious, not sufficiently learned, also a certain amount of snobbery because of his background. So, in particular, the Bishop of London voices his opposition, but it doesn't matter. It's really, even though officially it's the decision of the bishops and the monks of Canterbury, it's really Henry is saying, "I'll accept anybody as long as it's my choice, Thomas." So Thomas is consecrated, and something dramatic happened then. What exactly it was, people have been debating ever since. We know that he changed his attitude towards Henry, but the difficult thing to understand is why exactly that happened. Now, again, his biographers, writing after his death when he was already hailed as a saint, they claim that he underwent a dramatic conversion. They say that once he had become archbishop, once he had been anointed, he started to, he was touched by the hand of God. He started to put off the old man, put on the new, and he changed his own behavior. So they say that he started to wear under his archiepiscopal garb, he would wear a hair shirt. That
Wow.
is a piece of rough cloth that would cut into his flesh. And he above that he wore a monastic habit. But all of this was secret. Now, this is a very difficult claim to deal with because if it was secret, nobody saw it and nobody talked about it until after his death. But his biographer said, well, this is an even greater thing because out of humility, he kept it secret. So people could see on the outside the face of this, important bishop, archbishop, all of this, friend of the king, but beneath everything was different. Whatever about that. And, who knows? People debate it, people wonder whatever way. There must have been some personal change within him. We know that he started to take a different attitude towards the king.
Wow.
And
Hey, we're enjoying our conversation here with Professor Michael Staunton, and we're talking about Thomas Becket and his role as Archbishop of Canterbury and his martyrdom and his impact on Christianity, particularly in through medieval Christianity. So at that time period. So for us, just to kind of keep this in mind, we're well ahead, 400 years ahead of anything that would be the break of England from the Catholic Church, right? So we're really talking about the Great Schism that would have happened with the Orthodox Church had already been pretty much taken place, and so, but that didn't mean though that whoever was the ruler um, typically the king, but some queens, right, that would have been in some of these other spots. They still had an enormous amount of influence, right,
mhm,
with Rome and with others
yeah,
about what they were. And so it probably hadn't grown to the spot where there was a, you know, you're going to do what I tell you to do. No, you're not going to do what I
Mhm.
tell you to. Struggle, although those things were certainly building up. But this is one of those examples where the bishops and the others within Canterbury are going to go, well, we may have our own opinion, but we're not going to let our opinion get too far ahead of the king on
Yeah,
who we might think. Is that a fair way to say that?
that's absolutely right. Because now one of the important elements of background to this is that in the late 11th century, so we're talking about sort of 60, 70, 80 years before, you start to have, for the first time within the medieval church, some kind of clash between secular and spiritual power. And this is partly bound up with the developing power of the papacy. So over the previous, three-quarters of a century, you'd have you'd had various popes and people who were around them claiming authority over areas that they might have claimed before, but they had never really made it a reality. So you have, for example, by this time, if you're an abbot or you're a bishop or some other senior church figure in England, you can appeal over the head of the king to the Pope because the Pope is extending his jurisdiction into England, into various other places, whereas previously it was just confined mostly to Italy. So there's also a kind of a sense that spiritual power is superior to secular power. Those kinds of ideas are in the air. Thomas would have heard them when he was in Paris, especially amongst various theologians. But there's still a kind of a pragmatic sense for most people within the church, as well as those people around the king, that they work together, that they generally have a balance of power, that there's an alliance between them. There'll always be certain difficulties here and there, but there's no real attempt, or there hasn't been a serious attempt in England before this to say, these are the powers of the church, these are the powers of the crown, but here is where you get it. And it starts over fairly small things. So you've got a few skirmishes between Henry and Thomas over things like taxation. Um, then you get a more serious issue. And this comes down to its jurisdiction again. It's in the same kind of field as Henry and Thomas were involved just when Henry came to the throne. It's trying to bring order, reduce crime in the kingdom. And Henry argues that there's a lot of people who are in religious orders in England, and they are subject to church courts. And Henry says, these people are being treated very leniently. If somebody's convicted of a felony in a church court, they should be handed over to the royal courts. Thomas and all of the other bishops oppose this. They're going to oppose this. Similarly, they oppose ideas such as that a pope, somebody can't appeal directly to the pope, or a bishop can't just decide to travel to Rome without the king's permission. So you're getting these kinds of clashes over these, in themselves, quite small, you might say, particular legal issues, but they're part of something deeper. And in this way, people sometimes say that the Becket dispute, as it's become known, it revealed a kind of a rift that was going to come out some way or the other. But Thomas, and Henry really fired it up, if that's the right metaphor.
Right.
So what happened was that Henry gathered all of the bishops together, and as well as the nobles, and he demanded of Thomas that he agree to what he called my ancestral customs. So he's saying, this has always been the way things have been from my predecessors. The church has started to claim too much for itself. You've got to recognize my rights. And Thomas has prevailed upon to give a verbal agreement to this. And then Henry says, he's told, just say yes. He just wants his pride acknowledged, all of this. And nothing's going to happen. So he says yes. And then Henry says, okay, you've agreed. Now, some of my scribes go off and write down the customs of the kingdom. They write down specifically, no ecclesiastic is allowed to leave the country without my permission. Anybody who is an ecclesiastic who is convicted in a church court of a serious crime must now come to my court. All of these things. From this point, the relationship between the two breaks down. And Henry's main ambition is just to force Thomas to resign from office. But Thomas's position is hardening as well. So for about 6 months or so, they hardly see each other. Eventually, Henry summons Thomas to trial, and it's on, charges that there's not a lot of basis to. He says, for example, you embezzled some funds back 10 years ago when you were my chancellor. Do you remember there was that job of rebuilding the Tower of London, and you took some of that money for yourself? There's a few of these kinds of things where he tries to pressure him, he tries to get him to resign. And Thomas, for a number of days during this trial, he accepts it, or he's trying to struggle with it. And on the last day of his trial, he gets up in the morning and he says Mass. There's nothing unusual about that, but he says the Mass of St. Stephen, which is not that feast day. St. Stephen is 26th of December. But St. Stephen is the first Christian martyr. And the Feast of St. Stephen has lines such as about kings and princes have stood and spoken against me. And then he comes into court, he takes the cross that is usually carried before him, he takes it from his crossbearer, he carries it in himself into the courthouse, or the chamber where they're meeting. The Bishop of London, who had always opposed him, says, the man is a fool and he always will be, about Thomas. And what he's done now is he's raised the debate to a higher level. It's no longer about, who can travel to Rome or which court do you go to. It's about good versus evil. It's about God versus tyrants. That's the way Thomas is presenting itself.
You're not just taking
flair.
on me, you're taking on Jesus at the same time.
This is it.
Let's just
this
make sure that we're all clear what this is about. Even though it may be subtle, a little bit on the subtle piece of that, hey, I'm walking behind this cross and this is who's walking before me. So you put me on trial, you're putting the cross on trial. I mean,
that's it. Yes.
Is the not so subtle way of making sure everybody understood what the stakes were, right?
Okay. Exactly. And this wasn't lost on people at this time, because there's also, looking at it from the other side, it's reflecting back on Thomas and saying, well, I'm the successor to, St. Stephen, the early Christian martyrs. And he was actually accused by, again, the Bishop of London, Gilbert Folliot, of posing as a martyr. And even, while he was alive. And anyway, that night, he leaves court. He refuses to listen to the verdict, and he storms out. And that night, in the middle of the night, he gathers a few companions, and they sneak out, and they disguise themselves, and they flee down to the coast of England, and they take a little boat over to France. So Thomas is in exile for the next 6 years. And while he's in exile, he's in exile in France. It develops in various ways. The king, Henry II, he rules not only England, he rules nearly half of France. He rules Normandy, Aquitaine in the south. He inherited Normandy. He's got Aquitaine by marrying Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most famous women of the time. You've got all of these meetings between each other. For example, both sides send embassies to the Pope. Thomas stands up and he says, I'm fighting the fight of Jesus, and so on. His opponents, who are sent by the king, but are mostly bishops and other ecclesiastics, they say, we don't disagree with you in principle. We're all on the same side here. We want the rights of the church. We want the liberty of the church. We believe that they are being infringed upon. But these kinds of things happen all the time. Again, the Bishop of London says, you are somebody who, because of your rashness, have made something bigger out of this than you need to have done. He says, look at our saintly predecessors. They had troubles with their kings. Kings don't always behave in the right way. But what they managed to do is they did it in a subtle way. They were properly educated in how to do this. The problem with you is, and this is again a clever argument, the problem with you is that you didn't come up to this job through the church. You came through the royal court. You were a hunter, a hawker, somebody who liked feasts, all of this. Something that begins like this, it's never going to turn out well.
Interesting.
So over the next while, you get them sending various volleys in various forms. The king threatens the Pope, who is himself in exile for part of this. There's a papal schism, threatens him with withdrawing his support.
This is
If
during the
he
Avignon papacy time
No,
period,
it's
right?
before that,
Oh,
but
it's before that. Okay.
it's before that, but it's a similar kind of thing. It's the
It's
German
headed there.
emperor.
Okay.
The German emperor has chosen his own man to be pope, and the France and England have chosen Pope Alexander. But the King of England is saying, keeps saying, remember, you depend on my support. Meanwhile, Thomas is given by the Pope the right to excommunication, which he uses with great gusto and enthusiasm. So he will, in his first round, of course, he goes for the Bishop of London, excommunicates him. He excommunicates various other people who have seized the lands of Canterbury while he is away, various opponents. He stops short on excommunicating the king, presumably because he wants to keep that back. He's living in exile in this monastery in France, away from everything. The Pope has sent him there because he wants to keep him quiet for a bit. But then he starts to get more involved in excommunications, negotiations, political moves. But there's a stalemate until the year 1170. So this is about 6 months before his murder. And the stalemate is broken by the fact that Henry wants to crown his son, also called Henry. He wants to designate him as king while he's still alive because he's obsessed with this idea that he grew up having to fight for the throne. He wants to make sure his son is assured of succession. So even though he himself is still alive, he has his son Henry crowned. There's one problem with this. Who crowns the King of England? The Archbishop of Canterbury, and the Archbishop of Canterbury is otherwise disposed at this time. So, who does he get to crown him? He gets various enemies of his. The Archbishop of York, who had also been a young clerk in the household of the Archbishop of Canterbury with Thomas many years previously, never got on. Our friend, the Bishop of London, Gilbert, various others. Now, this is considered to be an outrage. Various people hear about it. They say, Henry, you've gone too far by ignoring the rights of the Archbishop of Canterbury in such an important thing. So he's brought to the negotiation table, and they manage to patch up a peace. But it's an unstable peace. Thomas is meant to be restored to his office in Canterbury. He's supposed to be given back his lands, all of these things to be allowed to live in peace. He prepares to sail back to Canterbury right at the start of December 1170. But just before he sails, he sends a boat ahead with a letter. And this letter excommunicates or suspends the various bishops who were involved in the coronation of the young Henry. So that's the Archbishop of York, the Bishop of London, Bishop of Salisbury. So he's, as was said in another context, he signed his own death warrant. So he comes back to England, and it's quite clear that there's still a lot of hostility there against him from friends of the king. And he comes back and he has to more or less just stay within Canterbury. He's threatened if he goes outside of that. He doesn't ease up on his own actions on Christmas Day. He says Mass in the cathedral, and then he announces various excommunications against other enemies. Meanwhile, the bishops who have heard of their excommunication or suspension are obviously shocked and outraged. The peace has been made, and this is what he does. They send messengers to the king. The king is across the sea in Normandy. And the king's response to hearing this is famous. The words that are often attributed to him are, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest, or who will rid me of this troublesome priest. None of the contemporary accounts actually use those words, but they say something similar. One of them says that he said to his court, he said, here's this man who came into my court with a limping mule behind him and a pack over his back. I raised him up from nothing. I gave him everything. And now look what he does. He lifts up his heel and he kicks me in the teeth.
Mm.
And then he said, and look at you. You're drones. Who are these drones who I see before me, who never avenge me on my enemies? And this was the cue for a number of knights, really quite noble figures in his court, to quickly set sail for England. And they made their way to Canterbury on the afternoon of 29th of December, 1170, where they found Thomas. So we come to the murder. Thomas is there in his palace.
Just to help people as well, I know for the longest period of time, I actually thought the office of Canterbury was actually headquartered in London because that was the capital and that's where it was. But Canterbury is actually quite some space away, right?
It's away. It's on the
east,
southeast,
right? Mm-hmm.
Exactly, on the southeast. Now it does actually have, after this period, it gained a palace in London, and so there was a very close connection with London. It's not that far away from it, but it's also, even more importantly for Canterbury strategically, is if you're coming from Normandy, you land on the coast, and as you're making your way to London, you can stop in Canterbury. So it's quite an easy sort of trip over the channel if the weather is good. And in fact, Becket's biographers say that miraculously there was a calm breeze that blew the knights over because his death was predestined.
Okay.
And this is helping it. So they arrive, they say they want to meet Thomas. Thomas is there having a discussion with some of his clerks, and they confront him and they say, why did you excommunicate these bishops? He said, well, it wasn't my excommunication. Technically, it's the Pope's excommunication. I have these letters that allowed, I can't absolve them. Only the Pope can do that. And they say, well, what about you're trying to diminish the king and you're trying to take away the crown from his son? He says, no, I'm not. And they go out in a fury. One account says that Thomas actually followed them to the door and more or less said, come and get me.
Get out.
So then the monks say, okay, the knights have gone out to arm themselves, and the monks or the clerks, they say to Thomas, we've got to get you into the church itself. The church is the sanctuary. It's most holy place in England. It's the sanctuary of the mother church of England. You're bound to be safe there. And he's reluctant, but he's dragged in, and they bar the doors. When they come into the cathedral, the monks are singing vespers. So what they hear is, if you think of it from the point of view of the monks or the people who have gathered, local people from Canterbury who are there in the church, the doors burst open, Thomas comes in, being dragged in by his clerks. And then a few minutes later, they start to hear this noise of walls being cut down as the knights are trying to make their way in. And the knights eventually burst into the cathedral. And if you imagine, it's 4 p.m., this is in England, getting dark, it's the middle of winter. The knights come in, they're fully armed. They've got full armor. You can just see their eyes, just through their visors. They've got their swords unsheathed. And they shout out, where is Becket, traitor to the king? And he says, here I am, I'm not a traitor. And they approach him, they challenge him. Again, they ask him some of these questions. The accounts that are written of this, a number of them are by eyewitnesses. About 5 of the people who were there in the cathedral actually wrote an account. One of them was wounded in the attack. He tried to block a blow to Thomas. So we're getting eyewitness accounts, but they're overlaid with biblical language. Thomas is supposed to have said, let my people go, this sort of thing. So how he was actually killed is the most confusing bit of it all and the most mysterious. What were the knights trying to do? The likelihood, I think, and I think a lot of people now believe, the knights weren't trying to kill him. They were trying to arrest him. And they did try to pick him up and drag him outside of the church because they want to get him out of the sanctuary, arrest him, bring him back to Normandy to face the king. But if you come into a church wielding a sword, fired up with anger, things can happen. There was some kind of a struggle. One of the people who wrote the account, who wasn't an eyewitness, but he did know Thomas well, he claims that when the knights laid hands on him, Thomas actually pushed one of them and knocked him on the ground, and that this knight then got up and swung at Thomas. The
Well,
first
my guess
blow.
is, and I'm just as a thought. I mean, this is not a guy who'd spent his whole life being an accountant and being a clerk, right? I mean, this guy
Yeah,
had some man's man to him, right? I mean, he was a hawker, he was
totally.
a hunter, he was a runner, he was a
Exactly.
wrestler, he was this. So it
Exactly.
wasn't like he was,
Yeah.
some impish, wimpish little guy that was, in
No.
the corner.
This is it's been said, here Thomas the Londoner came out
Yeah,
and he was going to stand his ground, and that's what he did. And
yeah.
it fits with the picture that we have of him. Very physically brave, um, sometimes quite rash in lots
Mm.
of ways, and reasonably tall as well. We have a physical description of him. So the first blow hits him, and then one of the other knights piles on. He falls on his knees, and then another knight and another knight. And one of these blows, as I said, hit the arm of a bystander who tried to block it. Other people are hiding behind altars and in various corners of the church. So Thomas is lying dead on the cathedral floor. The knights, as they're leaving, they they call out their cry of "We're the king's men, we're the king's men," and they ride out. And that just at that moment when Thomas was lying dead on the cathedral floor, he wasn't yet a saint, and the people around him didn't necessarily think of him as a saint. Their main feeling was fear, going by what they wrote about it afterwards. And
Sure.
they were afraid, for one thing, that the knights would actually take reprisals on the monks, or that they would desecrate the body. So they very quickly they stripped the body for burial. A monk who wrote after this said, as they stripped the body, they discovered underneath his lavish episcopal clothes, he was wearing a monk's habit, and under that a hair shirt. And he says, we turned to each other and we said, how could we have doubted this man? All of this was within him. And what you start to get at this point is kind of closes one chapter and it opens another, when you get the legendary Thomas, the person who comes to be celebrated as this great martyr. His acclaim as a martyr happened very quickly, and it was spontaneous as well. There are various stories, for example, that a man who was there in the cathedral, he dipped his cloak in Thomas's blood, brought it home, gave it to his wife, who was paralyzed, and she used it in her bath water, and she was cured. You start to hear about all of these cures. And it's a spontaneous kind of thing from the ordinary people of Canterbury. It's not as many sort of veneration of saints at this time are imposed from above. But in this case, there's really a popular sense that this is a saint. The word flies around Christian Europe. Absolute outrage. People start to threaten Henry on sanctions against him, possibly excommunication or other measures against him. his first response is actually to get away from it all. He goes to Ireland. This
Mm,
is the first intervention of an English king in Ireland. That's not just for this reason. There are reasons to take him there, but he does get away from all of this for a time. But eventually, he has to face the consequences. The Pope sends his cardinals, and they arrange a settlement whereby uh, Henry promises to go on crusade. He makes various other promises. He accepts that though he is not personally responsible, that he has a certain amount of guilt. The knights are sentenced to go on crusade as well, and it's thought that they did actually do that and that they died in the Holy Land. Meanwhile, the acclaim for Thomas is growing and growing. It moves from the ordinary people up the social ranks, really to everybody. Within 2 years, he's canonized by the Pope. That's a remarkably quick
really?
time of
Right.
canonization. Within 10 years, there are maybe 10 biographies written of him. Nothing like this before that in England. At the same time, you have this massive collection of letters that have been put together. So we can read about the dispute, and often, day by day, hour by hour accounts. So there's all of this. Canterbury Cathedral itself becomes rich from all of the pilgrims coming to see him. Chaucer, he's sometime later, but of course, as he said, that's the framing of Canterbury Tales. Well, one of the reasons for the success of Thomas as a saint, the person who took control over the cult of Saint Thomas, surprising person, actually King Henry II and his family. So one of the things that this did to Henry was that for the first time Henry was vulnerable. He
Mm,
seemed for the first time weak. So a group of people, almost everybody important who's associated with him, starting with his wife, Eleanor, also his son, Henry, who he designated king, various other brothers of his, the King of Scotland, the King of France, various lords, they rebel against Henry. And Henry is making some kind of fight back against this, but then he chooses a master stroke of image making. He visits the tomb of St. Thomas, and he goes barefoot to the tomb. And then he takes the shirt off his back and he's whipped ceremonially by the monks of Canterbury. And he spends the night before the tomb of St. Thomas. And that morning, as he leaves Canterbury, he hears the news that the King of Scotland has been captured, one of his main enemies, and really it now looks as if he's won in this rebellion. And he can say, his propagandists will say, he's been forgiven by Thomas. Here you have it. His old friend,
mm.
the reconciled, Thomas helped him win back the kingdom.
What a fascinating story all the way around, right? And one of the
Yeah,
things that always makes these so fascinating is because they're true, right? I mean, that's the
yeah,
thing that makes it
yeah,
even more
yeah, yeah.
interesting, and to know just from a historical perspective
Hmm.
that you don't have to go on one or two accounts of what
That's right.
somebody may or may not have. Certainly, there's bias that comes in anytime anybody writes
Yeah,
anything, but to know you had this many accounts of this many eyewitnesses and this many
yeah.
people that said that this took place and
Hmm.
what actually was going on. I mean, because the Crusades are right around the corner, right? I mean,
Hmm.
they're coming on pretty quickly, and certainly Henry's children would have a good bit of fame, right? That would be coming in
That's
that
right.
direction to do, and all of that underpinning and all of that kind of culminates
Yeah,
with a guy who didn't want the job in the first place, right? But
yeah, yeah. That's right. I mean,
but
I
you
think
gave
that
me the job, right? You gave me the job,
well,
right? And you told me to, I mean, I did it as loyalty
mhm,
to you, but you knew what the job was. The job wasn't to be
yeah,
your patsy, and it wasn't for me to be able to run. I took this
yeah.
as seriously as I took the other things that I did, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think that's
Wow.
right. And actually, there's one of his biographers who is a very close friend of his said Thomas was always great. He was great as a Londoner. He was great as chancellor. He was great as archbishop. He was great as martyr. He was good at all of these things. He adapted himself, and I think that one of the great things about just having so much material about him. A lot of the time when we hear about people from the Middle Ages, and particularly saints, we have a very kind of flat image of them. With Thomas, there are nuances. Like you can see, it's why nobody will ever really be able to settle on what quite motivated him here. It's not a simple story. We actually get the complexity of a person from hundreds of years ago. And that's something that we don't always get.
Yeah. Wow. What a fascinating piece. Well, tell us, your scholarship has gone beyond just what you have put outside of your brain and your mouth today with us on our podcast. Tell us about the book that you wrote.
Sure. It's the book is called Thomas Becket and His World, and there've been a lot of books written about Thomas Becket. What I wanted to do with this is, first of all, to explain it in an accessible way. And I thought that one of the things about the story of Thomas Becket is not just that it's a really good story in itself, but it tells us a lot about his world. It tells us about London when he was growing up there. It tells us about how kingship works, the King of England. What was his power based on? It was partly based on going down and knocking over a castle. It was also based on writing down laws. It tells us something about the church, about the fact that this wasn't just a dispute of the church against the crown. There were disputes within the church about the role of the papacy. We've got things like travel in there. How did people travel in the Middle Ages? What was their learning? And you've got also the idea of a saint and about popular culture. So this is something that reaches all elements of society. So I wanted to give a bit of a picture of medieval society, and particularly in England in the 12th century, which is a very exciting time.
Heck yeah.
And to tell it through a really good story.
Yeah, no doubt. Hey, Professor Michael Staunton, University College Dublin, history professor there, medievalist, right? That would be able to study on so many different things about medieval history, particularly how all that relates into the church history. Thank you so much for joining us and for lending us some of your time and knowledge on our podcast this week in Christian history. So
Thanks
we
very
hope
much, Nick.
people will sign in, and if you're interested as well, we'll have a link to the in the show notes to be able to purchase the book, so you can learn even more about this really critical and unique time of what went on within all things Christian history. Great. Thanks again.
Thanks a lot.